So I've been asked to talk broadly about some of the lessons coming out of the experience of the World Bank and other donors in promoting public administration reform in developing countries over the last number of decades. And you could say that I'm in a pretty good position to talk about the evolution of the agenda during this period because I was there. My career, as Eric has touched upon, and then my subsequent consulting and research since I left the bank pretty much kind of tracks the course of this body of work on public administration reforms. I was hired into the bank as one of the three kind of foundational political scientists, professional political scientists, to work on public administration in the mid-1980s. So yes, I'm super old, but let's not go there. For a host of reasons, I ended up working on public administration reforms, as Eric was suggesting, in every geographical region in something like 70 countries. I've kind of stopped counting. And even though, again, I did my research on Latin America and Brazil, when I came to the World Bank, they totally deracinated me. And so in addition to working on Latin America and the Caribbean, I worked on Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, and East Asia, where I ended my career managing the public sector reform program for that region. So I was kind of following this zeitgeist of public sector and governance reforms around the world. I would just say that means that I had kind of a catbird seat to the history of this field, as it were, and witnessed a lot of highs and a lot of lows in these reforms. But so this is kind of a personal narrative for me that I'm going to be sharing with you to some extent. And I would just say that a lot of the kind of mistakes and the errors in judgment that I'm going to be calling out, during my remarks are ones that I personally made. So I'm just kind of putting that out there. But I hope that this can also be understood as a narrative about how reflective practitioners can take lessons from our experience to try to climb up the steep learning curve of doing things better, and particularly in this field where I think there's still quite a lot to be learned. Okay, so just to set this up, I want to clarify that even though the topic has been advertised as public administration, I will be talking broadly about public administration reforms, but that covers quite a lot of stuff. That's, it could be, depending on how you parse it, it could be regulatory reform, business reengineering, center of government reforms, local government and decentralization, capacity building, on and on and on. And so what I want to do today is talk about the issues that I've really been more intensively and extensively involved in, which is a subset of public administration reform, and it's been called in the World Bank. We were working on an area called civil service reform, and so that's what I want to be talking about today. And broadly, civil service reform is about people. It's about how human resources are managed in government, what systems and approaches are used to organize and manage the people. And in particular, what practices for hiring, for paying them, for promoting them, for providing incentives, and disciplining, this large swath of what are often referred to as career public officials, the civil servants who work in the executive bureaucracy, and how this management of these human resources is directed towards making government work as effectively as possible. So that's kind of what the field is, as it were. So I'm going to take the next, I don't know how long, 30, 40 minutes to try to talk about this project of civil service reform at the World Bank, what was done in the name of these kinds of programs, how they worked out, and where things might or perhaps should go in the future. And I just want to put out maybe a basic premise, which is that I think that civil service reform as a field or as a subfield, at least in the international development sort of community and within the World Bank, has been kind of an underdog agenda. And there is it's hard to say exactly why. I mean, there are lots of reasons, but I think there's the sense that maybe it hasn't worked out so well. If you're an economist, I don't know how many economists there are in the room. I'll be careful not to disparage you too much, but I think it feels to economists like it's a kind of squidgy sort of undertaking, hard to kind of get your hands around it. But it's also been a perennial agenda that's persisted, and in fact it's grown in terms of the level of investment that it's received in places like the World Bank. And I guess I would argue, if we look around the world today, that indeed even in advanced countries, and perhaps even in this one, a capable professional civil service is intrinsic to the success of a lot of other policy objectives that perhaps have higher visibility on the international development to-do list. So it's a pretty important area, even if it hasn't quite gotten the attention and the respect, as it were, that it deserves. So just keeping this in mind, I think, I'll be coming back to this kind of tension or this irony or paradox about civil service reform as practiced in the World Bank, and try to unbundle some of this as I go along, and take a kind of tour of the civil service horizon, in the context of bank lending and operations. I want to do 4 things, and that is just to give you a sense of the context and the background, and then tell you something about, like a rough guide to what was actually done in some of the programs of civil service reform, and say something about their results, and then try to highlight some of the problems and constraints that have been attendant on these kinds of programs, and then maybe hopefully throw out a few ideas about what might be useful to consider in taking this whole field forward to the next level, and to do some of the stuff better. So I've already kind of moved into my presentation, so let me just try to. Yeah, okay. So just to start out with a little bit of definitional clarity, and so we can all kind of agree on what we're talking about. I just want to say that I think it's not completely coincidental that this is a field that keeps changing its name. So in the World Bank, I mean, every time there was a reorganization, there would be a different terminology that was applied to this area of public administration, and sometimes it was old wine in new bottles. So and you'll see this kind of in the literature. I think that this terminology was morphing from public administration, which is a kind of, with respect to my colleagues here who work deeply in the academic area of this field, I think a quaint kind of old-fashioned term. And when the bank started really getting into a lot of this kind of work, it first started calling it institutional development, which came out of a seminal, path-breaking world development report. The bank puts out this kind of annual world development report every year, and they had one in 1983 on institutional development and institutions in development and institutional development, and its importance to economic growth and so on. So that was kind of an early term. It moved then to public sector management, and then public sector reform to kind of encompass a broader set of issues. And then at a certain point, which I'm going to go over in a bit, it started to encompass the whole governance field as well. So very sort of fluid kind of terminology. And again, I'm going to be talking about this one subfield of civil service reform, which I've just talked about. So according to the World Bank, I mean, let me just go back here. Oops. This broader this definition I just gave about civil service reform being about human resource management or people management, and that was certainly the case for a lot of the work that we did in the bank. So again, these recruitment, promotion, incentives, performance issues, and that was all part of the remit. But I think in the World Bank, a lot of what came to be defined as civil service reform was also very much about the fiscal aspects of what was, again, in a nice, quaint, old-fashioned way called establishment management. This is coming from the Brits. A lot of the sort of terminology came from the British influence, which was very pervasive in the bank, certainly when I joined. And again, I just want to come back to this conundrum just to set up the discussion about this area. Civil service reform, I think, was often considered a problem child because the projects that were used to promote this kind of reform didn't perform as well according to some internal criteria, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So it was always a disappointment. But again, at the same time, the portfolio was growing and people were beginning to, over the years, to recognize its centrality and importance. And I think there's another sort of part of a conundrum that's useful to call attention to, which is also that there's a chicken and egg problem, because you're thinking about improving the civil service, the core government functions. In many countries where the human resource endowment is quite weak, capacity is low broadly in the society at large, and so the civil service itself is affected by these same human resource endowment deficits. And so how does government, or how does the civil service itself become an engine for development if in fact it's plagued by the same kinds of problems that the country is at large? And so I think that's kind of always been a struggle and a challenge. And the other thing is it's just a very complex set of undertakings. And I think one of the things that was often perhaps understood or misunderstood was that in some ways this complexity made it more difficult than some of the economic reforms that were being promoted by the World Bank and other kinds of the other international financial institutions, certainly in the early days. So I think that has always caused some problems for the agenda. So, okay, I've already told you what I'm going to do. Just talk about the context, the programs, the results, the constraints, and see if we can think about how this all might be done a little bit better. So just in terms of the context, I just want to kind of set up a sort of periodization, if you will, about really the evolution of international development assistance or aid to institutions broadly. And again, civil service reform is sort of coming into the mix here. So this is kind of artificial, but I think it tracks with the development of the programs that I'm going to be talking about. So this is all about what happened after World War II, when the current aid architecture was established. I mean, that was 1947 was the establishment or the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, so the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. You probably all know that. I think that in the period from the 1950s through the 1980s, what you had in terms of institutional assistance from the big development donors was taking place in the context of a bipolar world. So you had the two superpowers basically with their client states, and they weren't really rocking the boat. So they were providing individual or support to individual organizations or agencies to make them work better. So one example, I don't know if there are any Brazilians in the room, but the Embrapa, there you go. Okay, there you know. Do you know Embrapa? Okay. Well, it's a very well-regarded agricultural extension and research agency that was kind of the darling of the donors in the 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera. And this is a good example of a place where money was poured in from USAID and the World Bank and some others to kind of build this individual agency. And Kenya Tea Development Authority was another one that was quite well regarded. And so that was sort of one form of institutional development assistance that was taking place in this early period. Another was elite training. So Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, again, USAID, others were really invested in training policy elites in various countries, postgraduate training and so on. And so that's kind of the first period. The next period was starting in the 1980s. And I would say went through the 90s, but probably well beyond that. And this is kind of when I came into the picture. And it was really about fiscal adjustment and mostly providing assistance to what were then authoritarian states. And in terms of this was really coming off a sort of overextension of states largely in Africa, but in some other poor areas of the world as well. and the sense that the state was overextended, that many of these governments were in fiscal tatters, and so there had to be some kind of adjustment taking place to bring them back under control. And a major component of this was about the employment of lots of people in these governments, and wage bills that were skyrocketing, at least in the view of some of the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. So in terms of civil service reform, this period saw a lot of work on rationalization of the pay and employment systems, and that meant a lot of downsizing and adjustment of the pay regimes and the wage bill in general. And the key here is that this was not about an individual agency or organization. It was about a systemic approach to institutions for the first time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this adjustment work in a minute. And then I think, we sort of can cut off that period somewhere in the 90s, although again it continues. But I think the next kind of big watershed event that affected the way in which civil service reform was being carried out was the 1990s, when lots of stuff was happening, including the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Asian financial crisis that started, I think, in 97 or so. So in terms of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think there came to be a lot of emphasis on merit-based reform, so trying to build these sort of Weberian civil services that were operating in a non-politicized way, and again, I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. And I think the other area, the thrust of interventions that came to the fore during that period was coming off the Asian financial crisis, when it was all of a sudden what happened in Thailand and the corruption that might happen in South Korea was thought to be contagious to Wall Street and the West. And so there was this notion that good government, anti-corruption became a global public good. And I think that this coincided with the development of a whole new way of thinking about government, which was coming out of the new public management that was focused on making government look like the private sector, and orienting it towards a kind of performance management approach to try to organize it and manage it in a way that, again, mimicked the private sector. So this is kind of a lot of what was going on during the 1990s, a very tumultuous period. And then that takes us, I think, up to 2001, 9/11, 2001, and I think we're still kind of in that phase. And that was, I think, the sense that global terrorism and state fragility also kind of had reverberations and a kind of contagious effect on countries way beyond, let's say, Somalia or failed state Afghanistan, wherever it might be. And the sense that this sort of broader sense of governance, not just anti-corruption, but the whole kind of state capacity and political governance kind of issues. These were also considered to be now a new public good, and this gave rise to a lot of the work on institutions that was being done by places like the bank and many others. And I think in terms of the civil service reform agenda, what had been a kind of technical, narrow focus on downsizing and getting employment numbers straight and rationalizing pay and wage bills, had morphed quite significantly into a much broader exercise that was taking into account all kinds of political and broader institutional issues. And I think the other thing that happened during this period is that a lot of these authoritarian regimes that had been the counterpart for places like for the bank and others in the 80s, particularly in Africa, had now become democratic regimes, or a lot of them. So there was a whole new aspect to the programs that had to do with the demand for good government on the citizen side. And so all of these programs kind of had to open up beyond a sort of handshake between, let's say, the World Bank and the Minister of Finance, to a much broader kind of swath of the polity. And I should say as well that this was also partly about linking the kind of upstream human resource management stuff like paying and promoting and disciplining civil servants and figuring out how that might affect the way services were going to be delivered on the ground to these newly empowered citizens. And so the kind of service delivery and frontline services became much more important in this agenda. So that's a kind of very sort of rapid tour through the last number of decades. So this is an obvious point, but I just want to kind of quickly say that we're talking about a lot of different kinds of countries and different kinds of country clients. So civil service reform in one place doesn't necessarily look like it does in another. So again, some different categories of countries that are reified and probably overlapping, but middle-income countries were very interested, for example, in the performance agenda and the new public management because they were striving to compete on a global basis, and that's kind of they had a human resource endowment that was at a relatively high level, and this would be Asia and parts of Latin America. And then, of course, as I said, this is during a period of a secular trend towards democratization, with the demand for services increasing on the part of citizens. And so some of these new democracies, and this was all over Latin America certainly, were really focused on depoliticizing their civil services and increasing the meritocratic basis for their human resource management. And then I think that kind of dovetails with the post-communist bureaucracies that I worked in a lot in, again in the 90s and beyond, in both in Central and Eastern Europe. And these were largely bureaucracies that had been part of the party and suddenly now had to become more like Western civil services and hire their people on the basis of their merit and skills and their professional background. And then just finally coming back to the countries that were most active in this structural adjustment period when I joined the bank. Largely they were in Africa, but a lot in East Asia and South Asia as well, and a little bit in Central America. And they were really focused on, again, trying to bring their establishments under control, their employment establishments, but also, so that was the adjustment part, but also increasing their capacity. And so that also had to do with hiring in people who were capable and finding skills in places where they were in short supply. So that's kind of the tour of the context. So what was done in the name of civil service reform by places like the bank? Let me just go through a few, again, a rough guide to what some of the programs look like. And there are basically three areas. One is this pay and employment adjustment kind of agenda that I was working on most heavily when I came into the bank. So the basic thrust of these pay and employment reforms were trying to correct what came to be characterized as a public pay and employment syndrome. And again, lots of African countries were experiencing this, but you might recognize it from some other places as well. I think if you open the paper and look at recent coverage over the last few years of Greece, you're going to see this public pay and employment syndrome. That is, countries that had a very high wage bill in the aggregate, so out of all their budgetary expenditures, they were spending an enormous amount on personnel. And to some extent that was considered to be unaffordable. But in addition, or at the same time, you had this high aggregate wage bill, but you had, on an individual basis, very low pay. So these were civil services where people were making very little, and often they were moonlighting in other activities or absent from their jobs because they weren't making enough to kind of make a go of it, and so they weren't really being incentivized to work very hard. And the other part of this is that you often, I know when I first went to Ghana way back in the day, we were interviewing the permanent secretary, who was the highest level civil servant in the ministerial structure for each of the ministries in Ghana, and he was making very little more than his clerk or his driver. Because so the pay was so compressed, and you can imagine that it was just very hard then to attract and retain people with good professional backgrounds, even in a place like Ghana, which had just a very illustrious civil service back in the colonial period. It was just very hard to keep these people in place because the incentives were so paltry. So the pay was an issue, and the other thing was that nobody really knew how many people were working in government. The establishment control mechanisms were completely out of whack. The payroll was filled with ghost workers, and it was just very difficult to figure out who was where and who was getting paid what. Just a very kind of opaque system. And one of the things that accompanied this low pay syndrome was a very complex set of allowances. So in a way, what happened was that governments tried to sort of make up for these very low salaries. And I should say that the low salaries were a function of the fact that they were hiring a lot of people. So you have this big wage bill, but you're hiring so many people that you're spreading your wage bill really thin. And in order to kind of try to sort of get that permanent secretary as much remuneration or as much compensation as possible, the government would give him a whole bunch of allowances, which were, again, quite opaque and not connected to performance, and almost impossible to figure out who was getting what. So that was kind of the basic syndrome. And so what the reforms were about that the World Bank went in and the IMF was involved with was to go and get governments to cut their staffing numbers and their aggregate wage bill, and to try to raise the pay for the people who remained and to decompress it. So again, your permanent secretary is going to be making enough so that he didn't go to work for the World Bank office in Accra as a driver, because he probably was going to make more money doing that than staying as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture. Okay, so that's that. I'm saying. Okay, so the other set of reforms that the programs that the World Bank has been working on or has been promoting for quite a while, again, has to do with trying to build merit-based practices into civil services in various of its client countries. And this is about Max Weber and his ideas about how to organize the bureaucracy in a hierarchical manner in a way that depoliticizes its functions and reduces patronage. So this is all about coming off, in lots of countries, the spoils system that was doling out jobs on the basis of know who instead of know how. And a lot of these reforms that the bank was promoting, financing, helping governments organize, had to do with installing formal, transparent procedures, often exams to get into the civil service for meritocratic hiring, for promotion, discipline, et cetera. And I think that what the hallmark of these kinds of Weberian systems was that all the rewards, all the incentives across government were the same. So if you were working in one ministry at a certain level, you'd be making the same as somebody else with the same at the same rank in another ministry. And you advanced mainly on the basis of seniority, and this, I think, is the case in lots of countries still around the world, rather than by distinguishing yourself through performance. The other characteristic or hallmark of this kind of system is lifetime tenure. So this is a cradle-to-grave system. You come in you enter through the door as a relatively young professional, having taken an exam, and you're there until you retire. I should just tell you that the World Bank itself was very much modeled on this kind of arrangement until recently. So, but they used to talk about World Bank staff as lifers. You could also say that was like a prison, but that's another. So this is also a career model. So you come in, your identity is your rank as you go through the system. It's not about the job you do. It's not about the function that you're carrying out. I mean, this is, again, slightly reified, but that's generally the way these things are organized. So that was kind of one set of reforms that was very much kind of pushed or promoted through a lot of the World Bank lending over the last several decades, and still is in lots of places. So let's see. So that should be, when we think about the Weberian kind of merit-based civil service model, that's really what the reforms that came to the fore in the, I mean, they were really sort of gestated and kind of being cooked in as early as the 1970s, but I think in terms of the bank's own kind of activity in this area, these were the new public management, or the performance-oriented, or sometimes called new managerialist reforms that were really coming out of places like New Zealand and Australia and the UK and so on, and to some extent in this country as well. And these were about kind of turning the whole Weberian merit-based civil service model on its head. And instead of having this kind of centralized, hierarchical, cradle-to-grave bureaucracy, the idea would be to devolve human resource management decisions down to the line level of the manager, or to the line units. And so, big decentralization of kind of decision making. And you would hire and pay people on the basis not of where they were in the bureaucracy, or in some uniform sort of single spine. You would be paying people on the basis of what they were worth in the market. So you took market signals to determine pay. And again, this is not always the way it was actually done, but this was the theory that I think underlay the model. And it was very much about performance metrics, so figuring out who was doing well and paying them on the basis of their performance, promoting them on the basis of their performance. And the whole system ran on contractual relationships within and across government, and so individual, down from the minister down to individual civil servants were being held accountable, or in theory were held accountable through contracts for deliverables. And if they didn't deliver, their pay or their promotion path was to be affected. So those are kind of very rough sketches of what the reforms were about. I just want to say a word about the results. Again, this is a kind of thumbnail version of this. But I think that the pay and employment rationalization reforms that, again, I worked on for many, many years, were undertaken largely in the beginning through these structural adjustment programs, which were on a short leash. They were very short-term kinds of programs. So the World Bank would provide financial support to the treasury of, I'm trying to think of a country I can name here, to Zambia. And in return, there would be some agreement to policy reforms that might include downsizing or adjustment of the wage bill, or whatever it might be. And what happened in these reforms is that often after the money would be deposited directly and immediately into the treasury. So that would be day one. And the program would be monitored, let's say, for a year or two. And almost directly after that year passed, you'd see these employees who had been dismissed coming back through a revolving door. So there was the sense that these didn't stick. They weren't really supported by domestic stakeholders. Again, they were often organized on the basis of a handshake with the Minister of Finance, and they seemed not to have a lot of staying power. I think the other thing was that it became clear that they had, even if they weren't associated with directly with political upheaval, there was the sense that they were politically infeasible, that governments were just not really willing to take these, especially where they needed major kind of adjustment and major downsizing of the dimensions of government or employment. They really weren't willing to do it because they were depending on support from a lot of the people who might very well be laid off. So with this kind of not very successful record, the bank blinked and decided that we're not really going to be pushing these reforms that are simply not going to stick. And so they really sort of shifted the nature of adjustment and introduced what they started to call programmatic adjustment lending. And the idea here was that instead of having a 1 or 2 year program, you might have a series of 1, 2, 3 year programs that would go on for many years, I mean even decades. And that you wouldn't be asking governments to try to attain stretch goals. So I remember one of my bosses in one of the regions I worked in just saying whenever somebody came in and they had designed, they'd worked with government to design an adjustment program, this boss would say, I don't want to see anything here, that this government is not willing to do or not capable of doing. So it really sort of dramatic change in the way in which structural adjustment took place, and this very much affected the civil service reform agenda. So that what really then became much more prominent, instead of these pay and employment reforms and this rationalization of the pay and employment system, it was really much more stepping back and saying, okay, we're going to support incremental reforms that are really about sort of building the technical basis for maybe one day being able to adjust the size and the dimensions of government, but it might be about cleaning up the mess that in this establishment control context where you didn't know how many people there were and so on. There were all these ghosts on the payroll, so let's automate the payroll. Let's introduce an automated human resource management information system. Let's go out and count the number of civil servants through a civil service census or head count. And also, I think during this time we developed a lot of work on creating models, sort of simulating different kinds of pay and employment scenarios so that a government could say, in 5 years we want to have X number of people at this particular pay level with these kinds of skills working across these sectors, and this is what government is going to look like, and here's kind of the reform or the policy objective that we want to set for our civil service modernization or rationalization program. And I think that's kind of what really became much more commonplace. So I just wanted to say make just one comment about the merit-based reforms that I talked about a minute ago, and to say that it wasn't just the pay and employment reforms that had a hard time finding success in this area. It was also some of these attempts to introduce merit-based practice in client governments. And what happened often was that you'd find that a civil service might introduce a civil service law that established that you could only hire people on the basis of an entrance exam or merit, or there would be a very elaborate system for reviewing the promotion of civil servants, a lot of kind of formal adherence to a Weberian merit-based system, but often what was happening on paper in terms of laws or the formal structures was not really happening in reality. And the informal kind of behaviors that had a lot to do with patronage, and lots of people talk about neo-patrimonialism in many of these countries, that was really the rule of the day. That was how people were behaving. So there was this kind of disconnect between the formal reforms that seemed to be adopted and what was happening informally. So that was kind of the merit agenda. Well, the performance agenda that I was talking about with the new public management reforms and the introduction of this kind of harder-edged performance-based management, which was mainly introduced in middle-income countries, although there were a few attempts to try it out in some of the lower capacity countries that were pretty disastrous. But in the middle-income countries, this was an agenda that was kind of supposed to follow what was happening on the public financial management side, where a lot of my colleagues in the bank who were working to help governments develop more sophisticated and modern budget practices were trying to introduce this performance-based budgeting and a lot of these new public management or performance-oriented reforms on the budget or the public financial management side. And so the idea was that, well, you'd have this human resource management program that would accompany these public financial management reforms that were going down this new public management path. And so that's what was what Malaysia, which was famously successful in doing its, in introducing some of the new public management or performance management oriented reforms on the public financial management side, was supposedly doing this on the civil service side as well. But it turns out that actually it was much harder to do this kind of reform when you're talking about managing people. And so really what almost every one of these reforms found was that the civil service part of the new public management agenda was hollow. Again, it might have been formal, but it wasn't really followed in reality. So I think that was a pretty disappointing set of reforms as well. And I just want to say, though, of course, you know, for all of this, these programs, I mean, it really mattered where you were in government. So some agencies, some organizations, of course, as we all know, worked better than others. So, you know, you go into the Ministry of Finance or the central bank, and it would be humming like a you know, humming quite efficiently, but you go into the Ministry of Health or Education, and things would be less efficient and and the reforms were less successful. I wanted to just point out that there are lots of exceptions to all of this, of course, and so Vietnam was a place where they did some really interesting reforms, which is kind of surprising when you think that it's a socialist system, but they actually introduced a lot of merit-based reforms, a lot of performance-based reforms in their civil service. Rwanda, you know, poor country coming out of a Holocaust, but with pretty forceful leadership in the person of Paul Kagame, the president, was successful in a way that many of its neighbors weren't in introducing some of the civil service reforms that the bank was promoting. And then the other set of countries where I worked a lot in the period after the collapse of the Soviet system were these EU accession countries. These are countries trying to get into the European Union. You know, there was a time when people wanted to get into the European Union. And they were so motivated to, I mean, this is, we're again talking largely about Central Europe, but they were so motivated that to be on a par with the countries that were sitting across the table from them in the negotiations as they were entering the Union, that they really drove very energetically a whole set of civil service reforms that I think persisted until now. And I think that kind of speaks very much to the carrots that maybe were there in the case of EU accession that perhaps were not always there in the context of international development assistance or aid. And also I think it speaks to the demonstration effect of seeing, you know, a Germany or a country sitting across the table with a very capable civil service and wanting to mirror that kind of successful, efficient government. The other thing I would say is, just speaking to the one Brazilian in the room, is that Brazil was another place that, at least at the subnational level, at the state level, was doing a lot of really interesting reforms, a lot of which were supported by the World Bank on the performance agenda, in places where you might not have predicted it, and at a time when perhaps the federal government in Brazil was not as energetic on that kind of agenda. I wanted to point out that there hasn't actually been a very systematic evaluation of these reforms for almost a decade. So the last one that the bank undertook was to look at all the public sector reforms in 2008 that the bank was supporting, and they found that the civil service reform investment projects, I mean, they're investment projects where you're sort of just lending money to government to do specific things, and then there are, again, these adjustment programs where you're giving them money in exchange for their agreement to carry out policy reforms. But none of those rated very well. They actually were they all got ratings that were well below the World Bank average. So kind of an interior way of looking at it, but that was a concern to people running the bank, that these projects were dogs. So they weren't too happy with this. And then the other thing was also kind of an internal criterion, which is that the bank had, it still has a set of ratings that they use on a whole range of of issues. I mean, they just go across all sectors, but they in particular have a number of dimensions that look at the way in which institutions are functioning, or public institutions are functioning in a given country. They were called the Country Performance Institutional Assessment. And it used to be, back in the day, that if you worked in the bank and you were working on a given country, you sat with your colleagues in a back office somewhere and just kind of rated these countries. And it was very important because it determined how much money a country was going to get in the lending portfolio. So these were not insignificant. And you never told the country what their ratings were. It was very kind of secretive. Ultimately, these kind of got publicized and shared with countries and then made public. So it's a very different system now. But these were, the idea was that you were looking at these kinds of dimensions and criteria. And when the World Bank's evaluation group went to look at what was the impact of World Bank civil service lending on these institutional ratings, they found they didn't go up, even if they had even if that country had a civil service reform project. So it really wasn't making much of an impact. They also found that, predictably, I think, civil service reform programs, again, do worse in country, or projects do worse in poor countries. So again, this is this conundrum: if you have a poor country with low capacity, then your civil service is not going to do so well either, and the projects didn't do as well as the ones that were taking place in better endowed countries. And the other thing that they found was that in the World Bank, if you went in to do a project or lending operation in another field, and even in public financial management, it was de rigueur that you went in and did a whole lot of diagnosis. You did a lot of analytic work. I mean, often for a year or two before you went in and made a loan. But in the case of civil service reform, that didn't happen. The resources just didn't go into that kind of diagnostic work, and that was probably one of the explanations for why things didn't work so well. And of course, the other finding was that the number of people working on civil service reform with real training in the area and dedicated experts was the coefficients were way lower than for a lot of other sectors. So that's those are some of the results. I want to just sort of go through a list of some of the constraints and problems that have maybe contributed to these somewhat disappointing results, or just to say something about why this is such a tough field. So one thing is just about aid and the aid model. This is a topic that I think lots of people have been talking about for quite a while, but it has particular implications for civil service reform and development. It's really about the projects. Aid projects let's say you have a project for a few $10 million in Cambodia, because I'm going to say something about Cambodia where I did a lot of work. And the project is maybe trying to improve education or build a school or build hospitals or whatever it is. These projects, they have what they call project implementation units, and they're supposed to make that project run like clockwork. And what happens often is that those projects siphon off the best people from government. So people who would go into the civil service, again, they don't want to, they're making, in these countries where the civil service is so badly paid, any skilled individual is much better off going to work for one of these aid projects itself, working for a project implementation unit. And so they'll go and get a much higher salary. And so these projects are basically poaching people from the civil service, either would-be civil servants or civil servants who've just had it and decide to go work for an aid project itself. Or sometimes these projects actually bring in civil servants and they pay them. They're sitting civil servants. They've got a job in the civil service, but they go and they sit in a project unit for, let's say, 5 years that the project is extant, and they're paid a salary supplement. So they're not really doing their civil service job. They're going to work on this project. So this is a way of kind of draining the talent out of the civil service. And part of this is, this is perpetuated partly because donors like it. Donors have a collective action problem. So they prefer to have these projects like building the school, or building the hospital or the bridge and planting the flag. This is what we did with DFID from the UK or the Australian Aid Agency. This is what we can go back and show our constituents back in Canberra or London. We've done something, and here it is. It's palpable. It's on the ground. Those are demonstrable results. They're often you can show them in the short term, and they're much easier to achieve and get credit for, political credit back home certainly, than are these longer term institutional development results where you might not, instead of having a project going and actually delivering the anti-malarial protocol, you would be training people in government, locals, to be doing this work, and that would be a much longer kind of institutional development sort of approach, and that would be less visible to the constituents back home. A lot of this is the argument that Bill Easterly makes in a seminal piece that he wrote called The Cartel of Good Intentions, where all the donors are kind of colluding, maybe unintentionally or with the best of intentions, but this is the model that they've kind of developed. When I was working in Cambodia, a bunch of people were trying to think, well, how could we maybe find a way to, instead of having donors kind of fragment all their activities in a gazillion different projects in Cambodia, maybe have them pool their funds and pay civil servants better so that you actually have capable people to do the work, and you build the institution of the civil service over time. And I will tell you that starting with the World Bank, but having sort of tried to persuade a lot of other donors in the field, even very progressive kind of open-minded enlightened donors, they just wouldn't or couldn't do it. They really felt that they had to have this, they had to be able to plant this flag in the ground and have their own, perhaps quite little project, but something that they could go back and show the folks back home. So I think that this is a major deterrent to civil service reform, and it has been well discussed at high levels of international meetings of the DAC and other assemblages of the donor community. Everyone knows it's a problem, but because of this kind of collective action problem, it's difficult to for donors to kind of move beyond this behavior. And I would just say, just on the aid, the way in which aid does harm, it's also about what happens within aid organizations. The incentive structures within the World Bank or other aid organizations. And in the bank, what you got, if you were staff in the World Bank and you were managing a project, you're going to get rewarded by putting together that project, bringing it to the board, and then the perfect thing for your career, the perfect career move for you to make is to move on. And not stick around and wait to implement that project and see that it's supervised correctly over a period of years, because that means your career is stalled. So you need to keep moving, and that also kind of contributes, I think, to this the lack of accountability for these institutional results over a longer period of time. The other, I think, complication or sort of constraint that I've mentioned is politics. When the evaluation arm of the World Bank went in and looked at the record of these civil service reform projects, I mean, it became very clear that the problems weren't technical, because it wasn't that difficult to figure out how to design an automated payroll system or an information management system to keep track of personnel. But what was really difficult were the politics and the resistance and opposition to a lot of the reforms that were going to be resulting in winners and losers. I think I mentioned when I came into the bank, I was one of 3 political scientists. And I will tell you that the other 2 wouldn't admit to being political scientists when we were in the bank. But that's really changed. So there are a lot more people coming in with my kind of background. There has been, real shift in the staffing profile of places like the bank, and certainly in amongst the other donors. But at the same time, even though there has been quite a lot of work now in trying to figure out how do you kind of develop a way to analyze politics that will really inform the decisions you're making about the investments in civil services or a lot of other kind of investment areas that the bank gets involved in, there really never has been, this hasn't really been mainstreamed. There have been a lot of approaches, but they're kind of diffuse, and there hasn't been a kind of coherent, cohesive effort to really instill this in every decision made about operations, certainly on civil service reform, but even about the other investment portfolios in the bank. So I think there's still quite a way to go on this agenda that hasn't been. There's a path to go down. But having said this, I think that there's some of the other donors are less constrained than the World Bank, which has in its charter a proscription from getting involved in sovereign politics of its borrowers. So it's really not supposed to make any judgments on the basis of politics. But again, if you think about reform programs, I mean, they're so political that if you don't take politics into consideration, you're going to end up with this kind of failed agenda. But at the same time, there's a kind of, I think that charter, and also the fact that it's just been largely staffed by economists and engineers and some other technical specialties, it just makes it more, less likely, or an institution that's less inclined to go down this political path. Whereas there's some other donors like the UN and certainly a number of the bilaterals who are much more engaged in this, political agenda, and particularly as more and more of the recipients of aid are actually fragile post or even inter-conflict countries where the politics are really prominent. So just a couple of other problems, or a few other problems I wanted to, let me just go back here. So one is just, this is a long lamented problem, but it's still very important, I think, is just what are realistic expectations about how you reform the civil service, and how, what can really be expected? I think I was mentioning the short time leash on structural adjustment lending, but it's also true of projects. I mean, even if you're just going in and providing this kind of incremental aid to help a government get its payroll function in shape or whatever, I mean, these are still, or trying to introduce these merit-based reforms. I mean, projects are usually about maybe at most a 5-year kind of proposition. And these are reforms that really take a much longer period of time. And certainly the idea of introducing merit-based recruitment or promotion, if you look at civil service reforms historically, which is what Marilee Grindle did in her incredibly good book, Jobs for the Boys, which I recommend to you, she found that these attempts to introduce merit-based civil services took centuries, still are taking centuries, and that often these kinds of practices of merit-based procedures cohabited with patronage systems, and not necessarily, and this is just something that went on over time and never entirely replaced patronage kinds of relationships. And so that's something I think that to understand the history is really an important step that I think we need to be making about these reforms. The other problem I think that plagues civil service reforms and the broader public administration agenda is it's very difficult to draw a causal link between what you do upstream. Again, you introduce merit-based practice in hiring. Well, how does that actually affect what gets done on the ground? Does that mean you have a better program to deliver textbooks in schools, or how do you link up these kinds of upstream inputs and downstream outcomes? So there's a lot of noise around the metrics and measuring or evaluating the robustness of these reforms. So frankly, even to say things are a failure or a success, it's just very difficult to do that without some kind of way to really analyze and measure it. And I think the absence of performance measures for these kinds of reforms is something that everyone's kind of aware of. And there's been a certain amount of development of what are of indicators. You know, there's a whole kind of cottage industry of developing indicators to measure all kinds of things, including civil service reform. And the bank has been working for now quite a while on developing actionable governance indicators, where you can really say, okay, X number of people, excuse me, have been hired on the basis of a merit-based exam. So we know that this government is moving in the right direction. So these are some of the things that are kind of on the table and in train as we speak. But I think that maybe the last problem I want to kind of call attention to, I think this is the last one, is a pretty profound debate that has been kind of raging about whether countries are, whether the clients of the World Bank that have been the recipients of these kinds of reform investments are ready for these kinds of merit-based or even performance-based reforms. And I mean, that sounds a bit condescending because, and I think there's always a pushback on the part of countries that, why should we adopt these Western systems? These don't really fit our reality. But I think it goes beyond that. And some of the work that's been done by Douglas North and his colleagues in talking about the political and social and historical moment where countries find themselves, whether they have a kind of openness to the types of merit-based reforms or a rejection of the patronage or corrupt practices that have been historically kind of dominant. Whether it even makes sense for a place like the World Bank to go and push what looks like a kind of British civil service system on some of these places. Is this really a good use of money, and does it make sense? So I think that is definitely something to think about. And some of the people who say, well, no, it doesn't make sense, and what you find if you go in and push these reforms is that a lot of governments are practicing what Lant Pritchett calls isomorphic mimicry, where a government or a country will again put in place some formal system of merit-based recruitment, and the laws are on the books, and they're basically sucking up to donors, in fact, the behavior on the ground is really quite different. So that's kind of mimicking a Western-style institution, but not really behaving in the way that donors would like. Well, I'm just going to say also just that there is, I think, with all of this, there is a real debate within this field about what is best practice or what is good practice. So, given the fact that there are a lot of questions about Weberian bureaucracies, and there's a kind of constant change and evolution in the way in which people think about what works and what doesn't in government, that also kind of raises issues and challenges to the field in general. So let me just come now to my final set of points about what I think maybe we could do to make things work a bit better. One is if you go to the World Bank and you look at, you want to research maybe housing or food consumption or agricultural production or whatever, you're going to find a lot of databases that kind of give you cross-national information about what countries are doing, in various parts of the world, and kind of quite granular data. But if you go and try and look comparatively across civil service, either paid employment or performance data, it's very difficult, and you won't find it. So one of the things I think that would be useful to do is to kind of establish some kind of comparative data framework so that we can start to think about performance in a more rigorous way. The other thing is, of course, I think we need to be changing aid habits. I talked a lot about that. So pooling funds, donors could, instead of going into their own projects, they could pool their funds and send it right into the budget so that they're actually supporting the institutions civil service institutions and others in the country context. The other idea that I think is an interesting one is, again, to start to study, well, what is this connection between the upstream human resource management kinds of functions and the downstream effects. And some of the work that is being done by these randomized control trials, the randomistas, I think is quite interesting. I think there are limitations, but there are lots of ways that you can start to look at the kind of granular behavior and try to figure out, does this actually make a difference on the ground to things people care about? I've talked about the political work, and I think that needs to be expanded, deepened, and extended. One thing I just wanted to say, just a couple more points. One is just that I haven't talked about technology here, but there's always this question about whether you can kind of insert a new technology that will really sort of allow countries to leapfrog over decades of historic evolution in order to start to perform better. And that's certainly been discussed a lot in terms of civil service modernization. And often, it's not the case because, some of these things, again, are very behavioral in nature and they're not technology dependent. But I think one of the things we found actually in the Ebola crisis was that some of these kind of very interesting mobile sorts of platforms for paying people were used for these Ebola workers who were actually, the governments in Liberia and Sierra Leone were actually in arrears. I mean, these frontline workers hadn't been paid in months, and yet they were being asked to go out and risk their lives and go the extra yard to deliver these health services. So some of the technologies that were introduced in that period, I think, gave some insight about how transformative these kinds of technological advances can be, and maybe indeed help to leapfrog in some of the areas where there's been a lot of kind of resistance to change. Okay, this is my second to last point, and that is just that I think that one of the things that's happening, and you all know this, there's a global workplace revolution. Google works very differently than some steel factory did in the early 20th century. We're looking at a lot of different ways to manage people, and I think this is it's incumbent upon the donors and countries to start rethinking these stale kinds of models, either the performance-oriented model of the new public management or the Weberian model, certainly, of the standard civil service. And then finally, there is also, I think, a shift that's been taking place in the aid environment more broadly. I mean, there's a lot of work. I've been working with the Overseas Development Institute about thinking about the future of aid. They're thinking a lot about what development organizations like the bank and others should be doing. But I think that it has really shifted, in a way, a little bit the power kind of calculus. So, governments and countries, client countries themselves, are now much better positioned to be able to say to a place like the bank, which is now competing with a lot of other donors. It's no longer the hegemonic institution it used to be. This is the kind of reform we're interested in, and that reform that you want to sell us is not of interest to us. And so I think that this is going to be a really interesting way for countries to choose their own solutions and to choose them somewhat on the basis of their networking with other countries that are making their same kinds of autonomous choices. So I'm going to leave it there and hope that we can maybe get into some of the issues.
I want to thank Dr. Nunberg for a really fascinating, thoughtful, comprehensive, and systematic overview of just what is a huge topic area. And because it's so complex, I really thought it would be great if we could call upon Professor Resch. He was the first person I thought of when we knew that Dr. Nunberg would be speaking to us. My colleague, William Resch, actually came to us from the faculty of the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. His area of expertise focuses on how institutional structures and political environments affect the behavior and the perceptions of people working in public organizations. So what better line of expertise to call upon to comment upon the presentation we've just heard. So, Professor Resch.
Thanks. Welcome. So, turns out that institution building is really hard, right? She's, I think, selling the role of civil service reform within the World Bank a little bit short in terms of being underappreciated, as she put it, or understood. That's what she said. It does comprise about 1/6 of all World Bank loans, and so that's a lot of money, right? That's going towards this institution building. And public management reform, of course, is no longer the stuff of these narrow technocratic concerns, as you put it. It's become a much more political topic. Public management reform is featured often as a major agenda item in party manifestos and government programs. Reform ideas emerge within a network of various interest groups and individuals who are united in order to provide or promote some common cause or agenda in a way that influences government policy. And in this case, policy is how governments are actually managed, and typically, most acutely in the direction that institutional power is nurtured and leveraged towards particular interests. Public sector reform has become the dominion of an increasingly dominant class of management consultants and economists, mostly with private sector orientations, also academics and political entrepreneurs. And as a function of the influence of this private sector, of these private sector institutions who, they want credible commitment, right? They want stability in these markets that they're entering. With this has come this zeitgeist or intellectual movement that she identified as new public management. That's predominated debate and reforms over recent decades. And it's first and foremost, it seeks to treat governments as private businesses, right? Or like a business. And this ideology has informed a lot of the changes that the World Bank has sought to institute, right? But in many ways, the World Bank and our speaker here recognize that it's been partly diluted and partly merged with the realities on the ground. But it's exceedingly difficult to implement, right? Developing a science of administration has always been a preoccupation of political and management thinkers for eons. And one major lesson that repeats itself across time and various movements is that there is no one best way or single specific or correct view of doing or viewing public administration. States, the concrete institutions and organizations and people that deliver things like tax collection and social welfare, et cetera, are fundamentally a function of the history, the culture, the constitutional design, and the resources that are available to a given society, as well as these ideas that are actively engaged at some opportune time within that society's history. And so prescriptions for reform, and I'll quote Christopher Pollitt here, often are much more ambitious than the formal decisions that eventually get taken, and that there is then frequently a substantial implementation gap between what's intended and what actually happens. And this is indeed with this understanding that our distinguished speaker's talk was so enlightening, because evaluations of public management reform have been ambiguous or unconvincing at best, in many cases at least where they've been attempted. Public management reform has frequently been more of an act of faith than a piece of evidence-based policymaking. The recent explosion of these different international comparative indicators of good governance and the like have not fundamentally changed the state of affairs. So I would start the question for our honorable guest by posing, like, I'm just going to throw out a ton of questions that I have, but then I'll focus on one in particular. First of all, like, what major lessons can be drawn from these recent experiments in reform? What can we take from these big models that are embraced and then they're reconfigured and reconceptualized? Is there one model or a set of principles that can or should be applied everywhere? And I really think she spoke to this a lot. But I wonder if the World Bank itself is really cognizant of the relative fit of the big ideas that they are trying to institute and the fit of those big ideas to the on-the-ground realities of implementing them. And recognizing that public sector management is in and of itself fundamentally a political enterprise. What extent is the political economy of the given country understood and accommodated in the application of these quote-unquote best practices? Now, those questions are several, and in many respects they've been covered quite eloquently in your talk, so I'll start with the most direct. In most prescriptions for reform, we still see the MPM model predominate, right? And it's used in this word performance, right? So my first question is, what do we mean by performance in terms of government? And is there, as I think, if it is, as I think, a contextually and often politically dependent term, to what extent can we compare performance gains in one government to another? And what indicators of success do you see as having, the most promise in our modern age of reform? And I'll stop at that question, but to kind of give some subtext to that, what are we measuring in terms of performance? How do you measure the soft power of statecraft in diplomacy vis-a-vis whether or not your garbage is picked up or the potholes are attended to? How do you measure safety? And also, if you're doing so in terms of perhaps, general questionnaires to the citizens, right, in terms of their general satisfaction, to what extent are we protecting values such as due process and minority rights and basic human rights that may be allotted to a large swath of one given society, but not to everyone? And to that, I thank you for the talk. It was illuminating, but I think that there's a lot of conceptual ambiguity in the term performance itself, and that push towards a performance model really, in many times, it kind of turns my stomach a little bit to hear, like, oh, we just want our governments to perform well. Of course we do, but that definition of what performance really is seems to me very contextually dependent. So thank you very much. Yeah.
So, but I mean, I do think I was very fast and loose with a lot of this terminology, and I absolutely agree that the performance issues are just overwhelming and really daunting. And I think you've put your finger on something I also struggle with. I mean, if you think about, even in terms of the aid agenda, I think it was, was it last year? What year are we in? That there was a kind of revision of the what are called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and that used to be the MDGs. And this is all about kind of the aid, community in broadly construed, trying to come up with performance indicators and performance objectives so that they can kind of track their progress. And there's so much debate about whether this is a good thing to do or not. And certainly, there's a kind of there's the mantra I know which is that what gets measured gets done. And so, there's this tendency to kind of try to want to cram things into a into a performance measurement framework that really elude that kind. It's certainly quantified quantification or sort of very narrowly contoured measurement or assessment. Just because it's very appealing to have something concrete to look at. So I mean, I agree that there is, it's very difficult even for organizations broadly to think about how they assess their performance. And I think it's even more difficult to tie the kinds of issues that I've been talking about in terms of human resource management, again, this sort of upstream stuff with what happens on the ground. It's probably foolhardy to try to, over-specify a kind of measurement or a performance measurement framework. But I think it's still really difficult if you're in the business of putting someone's money, which is like the taxpayer's money, even if you're an international institution, it's all basically coming from, the world's taxpayers, as it were. It's very difficult to argue that, we should just kind of keep investing in an area on the basis of faith. So I think this indicator industry that's kind of grown up, the global governance indicators and so on. I mean, they're at a very macro level. Some of the work that's kind of focusing in on these actionable governance indicators is trying to sort of take them down to a place where they're a little bit more concrete. And I think that it behooves the people thinking about how do we either go back to the taxpayers or indeed the clients themselves? How do we know a program is working? I mean, you really still have to have some way to evaluate whether things make a difference, or else it is really faith, and that's the religion business. That's not a business I want to be in. So, it may be that I think there's a lot less attention paid to qualitative evaluation than maybe should be. And thinking about rigorous ways to really go in and look at what's happening on the ground, and maybe it's not something that can be replicated and quantified, with big data, but it may be that there's some way to go in and evaluate again on a qualitative basis. I mean, I do think these random controlled trials are very interesting. I think they're very problematic also because they purport to be looking in a scientific way at the way in which things are working, and then they overgeneralize to to a lot of other contexts. So that's kind of I think an interesting line of business, but maybe one where there needs to be kind of some thought about how to adapt it to these kinds of sort of less concrete, more intangible sorts of issues. Sorry, this is kind of disjointed.
We only have another maybe 7 minutes or so, so I don't know if Professor Resch has anything else he'd like to add? Or
No, I mean, obviously, yes, we do want to measure the performance, and we want to measure our kind of rate of return on investment in many respects, and if you're a bank, right? And my question was more about what indicators do you see as most promising? Not as much as we should just throw the baby out with the bathwater, more so given your recognition of the importance of the political economy, how do you adjust these types of performance indicators so that they're not so, isomorphic, so to speak, or like a coercive isomorphism, where you're forcing these performance metrics on everyone in a universal sense as opposed to accommodating each political economy?
I mean, it's interesting because I'm thinking now about a field, it's sort of tangential to the one I've been working, which is the public financial management, and they've been working for now a number of years with these things called the PIFA indicators. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's what does it stand for? It's performance, public expenditure, PIFA, framework, something, financial assessment. So they go into countries and with experts actually, and so they're also using some kind of common standards or indicators, and they go in and kind of do an assessment of how their public financial management system is working. And the idea was initially that in theory it is, that they will go into countries and say, how are you doing compared to where you were before? So it's not supposed to be on a comparative basis. Countries are not supposed to be competing with one another. But of course, they all do, because they are public documents and so on. But I think the idea behind that is where is the starting place? Where is this country maybe in terms of its own objectives, in terms of its own political context, and maybe where it is in all kinds of other contextual ways. If it's difficult to compare Gambia with Latvia or whatever it might be. I mean, these are kind of apples and oranges to some extent. So I mean, I think there is a path forward that is looking at a particular context and saying this is progress along the path that this country wants to travel. But having said that, and maybe just having worked in all these countries, you do. I do remember walking into Russia, just after the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the minister sitting across the table was saying, you don't understand the Russian reality. The World Bank comes here and you've got these kind of universal or uniform standards that you want to apply to us, and we're different. And I was just thinking that actually every country is different and thinks it's different and is different. But at the same time, there are some common standards that maybe need to be thought about, and it's an iterative process that I think anybody working in, on the ground in these kinds of situations is constantly, feeling that tension, and maybe that's a tension you just have to live with.
Yeah.
The entire presentation does illustrate the rich sort of and non-linear exchange between ideas. Here you could see how many different theories and different authors were cited in terms of understanding what was happening in terms of actual practice, in terms of the World Bank's approach to civil service reform, right? And so, and of course, what's happening in terms of on the ground as these attempts at engendering reforms unfold, and as we learn from those experiences, that in turn comes back to those of us who are working primarily in academia and thinking about, well, how do we rethink this? And it's, I think the presentation we have, and indeed the ongoing career that Dr. Nunberg exemplifies, shows that there's a very rich, interaction, and it can be frustrating at times when you're taking on big projects and seeing whether things don't always unfold as you'd like. But I think at the core, there is something in terms of development that we all believe that there is something there worth nurturing. And it is hard to define exactly, and it is hard to pinpoint, and it is contextual, and it changes over time, and it reflects our own biases and our own thinking. But that's life, and we all live it, and we appreciate your helping us think about how we engage it ourselves. And again, my thanks to my colleague, William Resch as well. Thank you.